Picture yourself in a cool stone kitchen, far beneath the creaking timbers of a medieval hall. Notice the way candlelight flickers against old wooden shelves, and how the air hall carries the faint scent of dried herbs and dusty grain. Allow this stillness to settle into something slower, something older. Tonight, our story will drift along the forgotten paths of the medieval pantry. There are no grand triumphs to chase, no complex puzzles to solve, just sacks of flour, scampering mice, and the slow decay of salted meat. Simply let this quiet tale become a soft current, gently carrying your thoughts toward peaceful rest. If this gentle journey brings you comfort, you're welcome to leave a quiet like or subscribe. I always love to see where in the world you listen, and the hour at which you drift off. Share your peaceful place in the comments below if you wish. It was never soft. That's the first thing to understand about medieval bread. It wasn't sliced, it wasn't fluffy, and it certainly wasn't the centerpiece of a pleasant breakfast. Bread in the Middle Ages was heavy, dense, dark, and closer in texture to a modern brick than a store-bought roll. It didn't rise evenly. It didn't smell of yeast and comfort. It was dry in the center, tough at the edges, and often contained more than just flour, water, and salt. Sometimes it held grit, sometimes it held ground peas, and sometimes it held splinters of wood from the grinding stones that carved the flour too roughly. But it was eaten, daily, constantly, with every meal, because there was often nothing else. In most villages across medieval Europe, bread wasn't a side dish. It was the meal. A poor family might have little more than bread and thin ale for dinner. If they were lucky, the bread had been made that morning. If not, they softened yesterday's loaf in the broth that had been reheated 3 times. And if there was no broth, they soaked it in warm water and scraped off the mould. This wasn't unusual. It was survival. And it started with the grain. Grain in the Middle Ages wasn't like modern wheat. Refined, coarse, carefully bred, processed in sterile environments. It was it was mixed. It was full of surprises. You might grind your flour from rye one week, barley the next, and oats the week after, or a mix of all 3. Whatever was stored in the barn, whatever hadn't rotted, whatever hadn't been stolen by mice or sprouted early from damp, that became flour. And the grinding stones? They were often coarse, made of basalt or granite. Each time they turned, they shaved off a little of themselves into the grain. Not enough to see, but enough to feel, over time. Dental studies on medieval skeletons often show worn-down molars, chipped enamel, and abscesses caused by years of chewing bread laced with stone dust. It wasn't malice, it was the cost of milling, and people ate it anyway, because they had no choice. Once the flour was ground, it had to be sifted. Richer households had fine cloths to separate the bran and grit. Poorer homes did not. So the flour stayed brown, coarse, and uneven. Water was added, sometimes a little salt. Occasionally a pinch of sourdough starter from a previous batch. But yeast, as we think of it now, wasn't known. Bread was leavened slowly, by wild fermentation or not at all. Flatbreads were common, dense, unsweetened, and sometimes charred. Baking too depended on means. Some villages had communal ovens, massive dome-shaped brick chambers heated with wood fires until the walls turned white hot. Ashes were swept out, loaves placed on the stone, doors sealed with wet clay. Families brought their shaped dough in baskets, marked with carved symbols so the baker could tell whose was whose. But oven access wasn't free. You paid in coin, in grain, or in turnips. Those who couldn't pay cooked their loaves on heated stones near the hearth, covered them with pots or buried them in the embers, and the results? Variable at best. Some loaves burned on the outside and remained raw inside. Others cracked open at the edges and turned bitter. Many simply collapsed, but still people ate them, because bread, even the bad bread, was better than no bread at all. The size of your loaf said a lot. Wealthier homes had lighter bread, thanks to finer flour. The upper classes ate white bread. Pain blanc, made from carefully sifted wheat, soft and sweet by comparison. The church too baked white bread for mass. But most people ate maslin, a mix of whatever grains were available, including beans, peas, and ground acorns in years when harvest failed. Sometimes even clay was added. Not for nutrition, but for bulk, and in famine years bread became dangerous. Spoiled grain caused hallucinations, sickness, and even death. Whiskered, a toxic fungus that grows on rye, was known to turn a bad winter into something far worse. Whole villages would fall ill. Some would seize, some would burn with fever, others would scream of visions and fall into madness. They called it holy fire or the burning, and no one knew its cause. The bread was blamed, or sometimes the baker. But they kept baking, because not baking meant hunger. And hunger was always worse. Bread wasn't just food, it was foundation. Meals were built around it. Trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, were used as plates, soaked in stew and then eaten or thrown to the dogs. Porridge made from breadcrumbs thickened with broth was a staple for the elderly and the sick. Children gnawed on crusts to soothe teething. Beggars lined up at monasteries not for soup, but for bread ends piled in wooden bowls. It was currency, it was comfort, and it was often just tolerable enough to chew. So next time you picture medieval bread, don't imagine the golden loaves from fairy tales or the braided dough of modern bakeries. Imagine a hard, dark slab, uneven, gritty, pulled from an oven built by neighbours, marked with a carved X to show who paid for its baking, and kept in a cloth bag to be softened with water one bite at a time. And that brings up the question, if bread was so basic, so flawed, so often painful to eat, why did people keep calling it the staff of life? The noise of grinding was as common to the medieval village as the sound of roosters or church bells. Day after day, millstones turned, slow, heavy, grating. Whether pulled by water or turned by hand, they worked grain into flour and flour into life. But they didn't just crush grain. They crushed stone too. You see, the millstones were rough by design, etched with ridges that grabbed the grain and tore it apart. But over time, those ridges wore down, they chipped, they flaked, and with every turn they shed grit, tiny flecks of stone that sank into the flour and went unnoticed until it was baked, chewed and embedded into molars. To chew medieval bread was to chew the earth itself. Not metaphorically, literally. Dental archaeology has shown us that the mouths of medieval people were ground down not just by age or poor hygiene, but by years of eating flour that contained the tools of its own making. Grit in the flour wasn't a defect. It was expected. It wasn't removed because it couldn't be. And over time it did its damage. Worn enamel, cracked teeth, infected jaws, pain that could last a lifetime. There were no dentists, no relief. A bad tooth might mean a lost appetite, and a lost appetite could mean a lost winter. But teeth weren't the only thing at risk. Bread, this humble daily staple, was a battlefield of survival. In times of poor harvest, people became desperate. Good wheat was reserved for the wealthy. The rest turned to substitutes: pea flour, bean meal, ground chestnuts, even bark stripped from trees and pounded into coarse powder. These loaves were dense, crumbly, and often bitter. They filled the stomach, but brought little strength. In especially lean years, people added anything they could grind: lentils, straw, spoiled oats, even dried moss. The bread changed colour, changed texture, changed smell, but it was still called bread. Sometimes the dough rose, most often it didn't. Leavening was a fickle business. A starter culture might fail. The air might be too cold. The baker might misjudge the timing. The result? A heavy, flat loaf that hit the table like a stone. It was eaten anyway. Hunger dulled expectations, and even bad bread was better than none. You didn't eat bread alone, you dunked it, soaked it, softened it in whatever liquid you had: soup, ale, milk if you were lucky, or just hot water. A common supper might be a slice of day-old bread, soaked in cabbage broth, flavoured faintly with onion or marrow bone. You chewed until it became a paste, then swallowed. It filled the belly. It left grit between the teeth, and then you moved on. Children were fed the same, a chunk of bread softened in goat's milk mashed with a wooden spoon. It stuck to the roof of the mouth, coated the tongue, soothed hunger, but it was never a treat. Medieval children didn't grow up with sweets. Bread was the dessert, the comfort, the constant. Even when it scraped their mouths or turned sour in the summer heat, spoilage was a fact of life. Bread didn't last long, especially in warm months. Without preservatives, it grew hard by the second day, mould by the third. But mould didn't always stop the eater. Green edges were cut away, blue spots scraped off. If the centre was still soft, it was worth keeping. Sometimes a layer of mould was seen as a sign that the bread had been made thick enough to protect itself. There were tricks too. Some rubbed vinegar on the crust to slow the mould. Others stored loaves in bags made of nettle or ash-dusted cloth. None of it worked for long, so you ate quickly. Or you repurposed it. Stale bread became trenchers, thick slabs used as plates. Not decorative, not clean. You placed your stew or meat atop the trencher, let the juices soak in, and at the end of the meal either ate the bread or fed it to the dog. In wealthier homes, the trencher might be collected and given to the poor, already saturated with meat drippings and gravy. This was charity, yes, but also practicality. Waste was not an option, not when flour came with the risk of theft, failure, or famine. And famine came often. A wet summer might ruin the wheat crop, a frost in early spring could kill the seedlings. Greedy landlord might raise rents and leave families with no coin for grain. In those times, the quality of bread collapsed. Loaves grew smaller, became harder, tasted more like dirt than wheat. But still people ate, because to stop eating was to admit defeat, and bread, no matter how revolting, was the line they held between survival and starvation. But it begs the question, if bread could betray the body so thoroughly, why did people keep calling it holy? They called it the staff of life, even when it bruised the roof of the mouth and left molars worn smooth. Bread, for all its harshness, all its grit and mould and density, was still wrapped in reverence. It was not just food, it was a symbol, a habit, a daily assurance that something, anything could be made from the ground. And in the medieval world where food was uncertain and survival was never guaranteed, that meant everything. The church played its part in this reverence. Bread was holy, it was spoken over, elevated, broken, and consumed in every mass. It became the body of Christ literally according to doctrine. The priest held it aloft, a small pale wafer unlike anything baked in a village oven, and the people bowed. Even the poor who ate only coarse rye or barley believed that within the walls of the church, bread was transformed. It wasn't about flour anymore, it was about presence. But outside the sanctuary, the bread just remained as rough as ever, and still it was treated with care. A dropped loaf was picked up immediately. To let it touch the floor without blessing was to risk misfortune. Some kissed it before eating. Others made the sign of the cross over it before slicing. Bread crusts were left for the poor or the birds, but never wasted. Even the crumbs had rules. A child caught brushing them from a table to the floor might be rapped on the knuckles, not for raw mischief, but for disrespect. This respect was not born from luxury. It was born from scarcity. In a world where you might spend 10 hours ploughing, sowing, or reaping to afford a single loaf, waste was a kind of sin, not just spiritual, but a practical. Bread kept people alive through sieges and storms. It fed entire households when meat was absent and gardens failed. It was soaked in broth, fried in fat stuffed with beans, torn into pieces and boiled with eggs and onions. It was every course, depending on the season, and when none remained, you were hungry in a way that reminded you just how thin the line was between survival and absence. This was why bakers had such a peculiar position in society. They were needed, respected in theory, but also watched closely, because a dishonest baker could ruin more than a meal. He could make people sick, he could short the weight of a loaf, he could use spoiled flour, mouldy barley, or too much chalk. He could pass off famine bread as ordinary and charge twice the price. And in a town where everyone depended on bread, that kind of betrayal wasn't just theft, it was a threat to life. So medieval towns developed laws, regulations, the weight of a standard loaf was checked. Bakers found cheating were fined, publicly shamed, or even nailed by the ear to the bakery wall. The Assize of Bread and Ale, one of England's earliest legal codes, set strict rules about pricing and purity, and still corners were cut, because flour spoiled, because firewood cost coin, because every baker had to choose between honest crust and affordable crumb. Most tried to do right. Most lived in fear of being accused, especially in years of poor harvest. They worked in heat and dust, hands raw from kneading, lungs coated in flour. They slept little, rose rawly, fed whole towns without ever being thanked. And when something went wrong, when bellies ached or children grew weak, it was their ovens people blamed first. But even so, they kept baking, because bread had to be made every day, without fail, because whatever its flaws, its dangers, its hard crust and rough edge, bread remained the anchor, the constant, the proof that something could be made from almost nothing, a bit of grain, a bit of fire, a few good hands, and maybe that's why, for all its toughness, it was still called holy, not because it was perfect, but because it endured, because it fed people without pretending to please them, because it held through war and winter, through plague and poverty, when nothing else did. And maybe, in the end, that's what made it sacred. Not the wafer on the altar, not the white loaves in noble halls, but the coarse round in a peasant's hands, hard as stone, stale by morning, and still enough. The pot was never empty, not because food was abundant, but because the stew pot, heavy, blackened and rimmed with soot, was where everything ended up. It was a fixture in medieval kitchens, and it rarely left the fire. Hung above the hearth or nestled among hot coals, it simmered day after day, fed by scraps and remnants, bones and roots, whatever could be spared or scrounged. It wasn't a recipe, it was survival. And its contents? They were never quite the same from one day to the next. This was not stew in the modern sense, a hearty broth filled with measured ingredients and served fresh in porcelain bowls. This was medieval potage, and it was alive in the way only long-simmered things are, changing hourly, thickening with starch and bone, growing darker, stronger, stranger. You didn't cook it all at once, you added to it. A cut of meat if you had it. The end of a cabbage, a handful of barley, yesterday's bread crusts, a bit of sour ale, an onion half sprouted, bone gnawed bare but not yet boiled. There were no measuring cups, only instinct, and a well-practiced understanding of what wouldn't kill you. Because in truth no one really trusted what was in the pot. They only hoped it was enough. Enough to quiet a stomach, enough to stretch across 6 mouths, enough to last until the next market day, or the next slaughter, or the next turnip harvest. It didn't matter if it was good, it mattered that it was hot, that it filled a bowl, that it covered the taste of rot or old flour or a stomach turned sour from days without meat. Sometimes there was flavour. Garlic maybe, if it had dried well. Leeks were common, leeks were strong. You could put a single leek in a pot and make a dozen mouths believe it was rich. Herbs, if you had them, came from the garden. Sage, thyme, sorrel. Dandelions were free. Nettles were bitter, but boiled long enough they softened. Pepper was rare. Salt, if you lived inland, was precious. Spices? Exotic and expensive, more likely to be found in the pouches of merchants than in the pot of a ploughman. But what went into the stew wasn't always food, not in the way we think of it. Old bones with marrow long gone were thrown in to thicken the broth. Cheese rinds, hardened and sharp, were boiled until they softened enough to chew. Fish heads, chicken feet, pig ears, anything that might give up one last scrap of flavour found its way in. If it could boil, it could feed, and sometimes woolbeer. Things slipped in that weren't meant to. A beetle hiding in a cabbage leaf, a mouse that had nested too near the grain sack, lump of mouldy flour mistaken for dried beans. There were no health inspectors, no kitchens with stone counters and clean knives. The cook, often the oldest woman in the household, used a single wooden spoon for everything, rinsed it with hot water and hung it to dry by the fire. The pot itself was never truly clean. It was wiped, maybe, rinsed if the water was plentiful, but always returned to the coals before the last drop had cooled. It was said that the best stew pots were never emptied, that the flavour grew stronger with time, that a pot never scrubbed bore the memory of 100 meals, and that memory was what gave the broth its strength. In some households the pot stayed on the fire for a week straight. Add water, add scraps, stir, serve and start again. If you were lucky, meat might appear, bacon rind, a bit of salted fish, a pigeon caught with slingshot or trap, but more often the protein came from pulses, beans, lentils, peas. Dried and stored in cloth sacks, they were boiled to mush and thickened with barley. A good potage was hearty enough to spoon. A better one stuck to the sides of the bowl. The best one? It stretched through 3 days and 4 meals without ever growing sour. Unless, of course, it did grow sour. Food spoiled fast, there were no fridges, no reliable cool spots, and in summer a pot left too long could turn before morning. People ate it anyway. Some added more salt, some boiled it twice. Others said a bit of sourness meant the stew had strength, that it had body, that it had fermented just enough to count as food and drink in one. Spoons were shared, bowls too. A family might pass the pot from one to another, each dipping in, blowing across the surface, chewing slowly. There were no second helpings unless someone else refused theirs, and there were no complaints. Complaining about food was a luxury for people who had options. Medieval stew wasn't romantic, it wasn't rustic cuisine served with wine and candlelight. It was the reality of eating in a world where harvests failed, winters lingered, and hunger never knocked. It walked right in, and yet they kept the pot simmering, because to let it go cold was to admit defeat. But that leads to the question, if the stew never stopped cooking, how long before it stopped being food? By the 3rd or 4th day, the stew began to take on a personality of its own. Not a pleasant one, necessarily, but something familiar. The edges of flavour began to blur. The barley swelled, the beans softened to paste, the bits of onion or parsnip dissolved into the broth until there was nothing to identify, only texture and colour, dull brown, with flecks of green and black, depending on the luck of the garden or the generosity of the neighbour. The pot, always hot, always near the fire, bubbled slowly like breath from a heavy sleeper. It didn't roar, it murmured, a low, continuous sound that said, "Still here, still waiting." Households adapted to it. Children learned not to ask what was in the pot. That question had no answer. What was in it today might not be in it tomorrow. A rat caught in a trap, a handful of nettles, half a carrot that had gone soft but not mouldy. You didn't ask. You trusted, or rather you decided not to think too hard. The taste didn't matter as much as the warmth, the way it filled the belly. Hunger, after all, quiets most of the senses. Not every stew was made equal. Poorer households made what was known as pottage, a thick, porridge-like blend of grains and legumes, boiled until it could be eaten with a flat piece of bread or scooped with fingers. It wasn't truly liquid, but it wasn't solid either. It existed in between. Like so many things in the medieval pantry, it was defined less by ingredients than by what it was not. Not soup, not bread, not entirely foul, just enough. The wealthy ate stew too, of course, but theirs was different. Their cooks peeled the vegetables, their meat came salted or freshly butchered, their kitchens had herbs in bundles, pepper in sealed boxes, and saffron locked in jars. Even so, their pots were rarely cleaner. Because the practice remained: boil, add, stir, serve. The only difference was what you had to throw in. The truly poor made do with water. They boiled stones in it for heat, added dried leaves or grass for volume, and called it soup. If it smelled vaguely edible, it was food. Some ground roots into paste, added a bit of oil, and thinned it out with rainwater. "What have you had it?" was added at the end, because it was too precious to waste on flavour you couldn't taste. You wanted it to hit your tongue directly. And always, the pot stayed warm. It couldn't be allowed to go cold, not because it was sacred, but because it was dangerous. Cold stew could spoil overnight. Bacteria, though unnamed, were known in effect. People who ate from a pot that had gone still and sour often ended up doubled over. Or worse, so it simmered, even gently. A few embers, a bit of heat, just enough to keep it breathing. The pot's age was measured not in years, but in meals. You didn't count how long you'd had it. You counted how many mouths it had filled. Some pots, they said, had never been emptied fully. They had fed the same family for 3 generations, not out of tradition, but necessity. Cleaning it meant losing flavour, and flavour meant strength. There was belief, too, part superstition, part logic, that the longer a stew lasted, the better it became. Like a story retold, it grew richer with each retelling. But that richness carried risks, especially in summer. Flies, mould, the green shimmer that crept in around the edges. You scraped it off, stirred it in, boiled it harder, covered it with cloth. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But what choice did you have? The alternative was hunger, and hunger was always waiting just outside the door, patient and cruel. People learned to eat around the rot, to sip carefully, to smell before tasting, to tilt the spoon and watch for movement. And yes, sometimes to bury the pot entirely and start again. There were stories, of course, told by firelight, muttered by grandmothers, remembered vaguely in moments of queasy silence, about stew gone bad, deadly bad. Tales of families who ate too much too fast and didn't rise the next morning. Strange smells no one could name, of meat that moved when stirred. Were they true? Hard to say, but true enough that people listened, because the line between nourishment and poison was always thin, especially when dinner had been cooking for a week. Still, the pot remained, because it had to. It was the beating heart of the home, blackened on the outside, bubbling on the inside, filled with more desperation than design. It held the waste and the precious. It held everything that couldn't be wasted. A family's fortune could be read in its contents, and a village's hardship could be measured in how many bones showed up at the bottom. But how long could it last? How long could one pot, stirred and scraped and added to, go on feeding a household before something slipped in that couldn't be stirred away? Eventually, even the most faithful stew had to end. It wasn't declared. There was no ceremony, just a moment, quiet, practical, when the pot was emptied one final time, scrubbed with sand or ash, and set upside down to dry. Maybe the last spoonful had turned too sour. Maybe someone got sick. Maybe there was simply nothing left to put in. Whatever the reason, the cycle paused, and the hearth, suddenly cold, looked smaller than it had in weeks. But the memory of the stew lingered. It lingered in the flavour of the next meal, in the quiet scrape of spoons against bowls, in the instinct to reach for a ladle that wasn't there. The stew had been more than a dish. It had been a ritual, a rhythm, companion through lean days and quieter evenings. Its absence felt like silence. Still, the pot always returned. Cleaned, maybe cracked, maybe newly patched with iron if you were fortunate enough to know someone with the skill. Because no one could live without the pot for long. Not peasants, not merchants, not even the cloistered monks who boiled root vegetables in shibtas and called it penance. The pot returned because hunger always did, and when it did, the rules were the same. You didn't start with meat. You started with water, then salt if you had it, then onions, then barley, then hope. Hope that someone had a bit of dried fish to spare, that someone found a parsnip not too soft to eat, that you'd caught something in the trap that morning, or the neighbour still owed you a chicken foot. You stirred these things together slowly, cautiously, not for flavour, for bulk. A good stew didn't taste good. It lasted. That was the measure of a meal. Could it stretch? Could it feed 6 when you had enough for 4? Could it hold through 3 days of reheating? Could it accept a crust of bread or a ladle of milk without turning sour? The answer was never in the ingredients. It was in the patience. Because stew taught you how to wait, how to stretch, how to work with what you had. It reminded you of what was edible, what was tolerable, what could pass for sustenance when there was nothing else. And yes, it reminded you what was too far gone. The mould on the meat that no heat could hide. The smell that wouldn't lift even after 3 boils. The texture of a root gone black inside. Even in hunger there were limits, but they were flexible. One woman's refusal was another's supper. In the end, it wasn't about taste. It was about presence. The presence of something warm, something shared, something that made your belly ache a little less and your hands feel less empty. So the pot returned, and with it came the scraping and stirring, the whispered guesses about what had gone in, and the cautious joy of finding something solid at the bottom. It wasn't celebration, it was survival. And the most revolting part? That survival, tasteless, grey, sometimes foul, was something people called a good day. It was supposed to be a treat. Meat in the medieval world wasn't an everyday event. It was a guest at the table, not a resident, invited when the hunt was good, when a feast was called, when the pig had been slaughtered and the innards dealt with before the sun set. For the poor, meat was aspiration. For the middling classes, it was occasional. And even for the rich, it came with compromises, because in a world without refrigeration, freshness was relative. If you lived in the countryside and butchered your own livestock, meat came in a wave, more than you could eat in a day, less than would last a week. A pig was slaughtered at the start of winter, and the parts you couldn't salt or smoke were boiled, stewed, dried, or buried in fat to preserve them. The first day the flesh was pink, tender, familiar. By the 3rd it was beginning to turn, by the 7th it had changed colour, by the 10th it had changed smell. Still it was eaten, because meat was meat. Even when it was green, people knew the signs. A sourness on the surface, a sticky film that didn't rinse off, the bloom of mould that curled at the edges of a cut. Some trimmed it away. Others boiled the meat until the water turned grey, then added herbs to cover the rest. Garlic helped. So did vinegar. So did hunger, and hunger always had the final word. In towns, where meat came from butchers rather than backyards, it wasn't much better. Carcasses hung from hooks in open air, swaying gently in the breeze. Flies gathered in the summer. Rats scouted below. The meat was displayed proudly, feathers still attached to game birds, blood still damp on slabs of veal, but its journey from animal to table was far from hygienic. The butcher wiped his hands on his apron. The knife was rarely cleaned. The meat might be dragged through a dusty lane to the cook's door, and then it began to rot. Slower in winter, faster in spring, but always. Spoilage didn't mean waste. It meant work, boiling, salting, drying, masking. There were whole categories of dishes designed not for flavour but for safety. Meats were simmered in ale to kill off the worst, buried in strong herbs to disguise the rest, wrapped in dough, fried or chopped fine and turned into pies, where the line between decay and spice was blurred entirely. You didn't ask how old the meat was, you asked what it had been soaked in. Pork especially was risky. Parasites were poorly understood but well remembered. A bad sausage could twist the gut. A bad cut could end a winter. But pigs were cheap to feed and easy to keep, so they remained essential. Every part was used, even the parts no one liked. Hooves became broth, ears were stewed. Stomach linings were scrubbed, stuffed, and sewn shut with twine. And then there was mutton. Old sheep meat, tough and grey, barely chewable unless boiled for hours. It smelled strong. Some said it tasted of wool. Others called it robust. It wasn't meant to be eaten fresh. It was made to endure. A dish of mutton stew, reheated 3 times, was considered to normal. 4th time if you were bold. Or poor. Beef was better. Richer, but expensive, and not always available. A cow was not slaughtered lightly. It gave milk, pulled carts, fertilised fields. Killing it meant losing those things, so beef was rare. And when it did appear, it was often old, tough, and needed pounding with wooden mallets to make it chewable. So yes, there was meat. On Mondays, on feast days, on borrowed coin. But it wasn't always something to savour. It was something to work around, to rescue, to justify. And every household had its own threshold for what edible really meant. But that raises the question, when the meat turned, did the mind turn with it? There were only so many ways to fight spoilage, and none of them made the meat taste better. Salt was the first weapon, coarse, mineral-rich, often harvested by hand or traded at great cost. Salt preserved meat by drawing out moisture and sealing it against decay. But the process was imperfect. If the salt was impure, if the cut was too thick, if the meat wasn't packed tightly or the weather turned warm too soon, rot crept in anyway. Salted meat tasted like the barrel it came from. Dry, leathery, soaked through with the brine. You chewed it slowly, not to enjoy it, but to wear it down enough to swallow. It was better than death. That was the metric in the medieval kitchen. Not pleasure, not nourishment. Just survival. You didn't eat to thrive. You ate to endure. Smoke was the second line of defence. Hams and sausages, strings of fish, slabs of fatback hung above low fires, turned slowly over days. The smoke curled around them, dried the flesh, sealed it. But it also flavoured everything, harsh, acrid, dense. Smoked meat wasn't just meat with a tinge. It was smoke first, food second, it clung to the mouth. It stayed in the walls. In winter, the entire house reeked of it, and no one noticed anymore. If the smell faded, that was when you worried, because it meant the meat had turned. Sometimes you used vinegar. Not the sharp, bright vinegar we know today, but thick, cloudy stuff made from spoiled wine, left in barrels until the sourness overtook the sugar. You poured it over cuts of meat to buy a few more days. You marinated. You stewed. You hoped. Pickling worked too, in theory, but not for meat. Not unless you had jars, spices, thyme. Most didn't. Instead, you turned to tricks. Rinse the meat in ale, rub it with garlic, boil it 3 times, skimming the scum each round and pretending it meant cleanliness. Add mustard, add horseradish, add anything strong enough to make you forget what the meat smelled like when you unwrapped it. Recipes weren't instructions, they were evasions. How do you cook old beef? You don't ask. You grind it, stuff it, hide it in a pie. The crust sealed it, the spices disguised it, and if the smell came through you called it strong. No one admitted that half the kitchen's time was spent in negotiations with decay. Cooks were not chefs. They were managers of rot. They poked, sniffed, scraped, trimmed. They knew the signs, the way fat separated when it turned, the green edge along the gristle, the hiss a joint made when cut too late. They had knives for meat, and knives for saving meat. One to carve, one to remove the part that might kill you. It was said that a good cook could keep a bad cut going for 4 days. By the 5th, only dogs would eat it. But many households didn't have that luxury. The 5th day came, and the stew pot waited, because meat, even spoiled, was still protein. And protein, in a world of bread and broth and boiled grains, was gold. So you added it anyway, boiled it harder, salted it deeper, and told yourself it was fine, and most of the time it was, until it wasn't. There were no thermometers, no labels, no dating systems, only mouths and bellies, and the knowledge passed from one stomachache to another. If 3 people grew sick, you blamed the weather. If someone died, you blamed the butcher, but no one blamed the stew, because to question it was to admit you had no other options, and that kind of truth didn't belong at the table, so you passed the plate, closed your eyes, and chewed. But what happens when you forget how meat is supposed to taste? Eventually your mouth stopped noticing. When you'd gone long enough without a fresh cut of meat, truly fresh, the kind that didn't need boiling, rinsing, trimming or praying over, you stopped measuring taste by tenderness. You stopped expecting juice, or colour, or anything that reminded you of springtime hunts or autumn feasts. Meat became texture, resistance, warmth. It was a presence in the bowl, and for most medieval eaters, that was enough. The poor, when they got meat at all, weren't offered it raw or untouched. It came in scraps, a strip of skin, a tough sinew, a rib with more bone than flesh. These were chopped into stews buried in grain, cooked down with onions or leeks, and served with apologies disguised as recipes. You didn't say, "This is all we have." You said, "It's been boiled long." That was how you dignified the meal. In the homes of tradesmen or low clergy, meat came more often, but still not often enough to forget what scarcity felt like. They salted small game, kept sausages hanging from wooden beams, and saved the best cuts for guests or feast days. On regular days, they ate the rest. The organs, the connective tissue, the parts that needed pounding or hours of stewing to become chewable. Liver, tongue, heart. If you had a pig, its head was a week's worth of meals boiled to jelly. The meat scraped from the cheeks and jowls, served in thick slices with mustard or horseradish to distract the tongue. And even in noble halls, where the spit turned and the platters gleamed, freshness wasn't guaranteed. Meat came in shipments, wrapped in hearth and tools and hay, carried for days across rough roads. By the time the boar arrived, it had sweated through the wrappings. The venison had aged, not in coolers, but in air thick with flies. Cooks trimmed and flamed and seasoned what they could. The rest they buried in pastry or stewed in wine, trusting that no one would ask too many questions once the spices took over. That was the truth of medieval meat. It wasn't about indulgence. It was about masking decay with ritual. The feast table became theatre. A roasted swan redressed in its feathers, beak painted gold, a peacock stuffed with spices, sewn shut and perched upright for presentation. These weren't meals, they were messages. They said, "We can afford meat even when we shouldn't." They said, "We can disguise the old as new," and no one at the table dared admit that sometimes they chewed with caution, that they counted the hours after a meal and listened to their bellies for signs of regret. And perhaps this is why the sauces grew so bold, why the spices imported from far-off coasts were weighed like gold, why vinegar and wine were used not to enhance but to obscure. Because somewhere beneath the pageantry everyone knew that meat could not be trusted, that the roast might carry more than pride, that the broth might hold more than warmth, that survival meant forgetting how fresh was supposed to taste. But forgetting came easy. It came in the second helping, in the stew served cold the next day, in the hunger that erased suspicion faster than salt could kill a parasite. And so they ate. They blessed the meal. They wiped their fingers on cloth. They praised the cook even when they knew better. Because in a world where winter was long and mouths were many, the meat on Monday was never judged by its colour. It was judged by whether or not it lasted. You learned to shake the sack before opening it, not to stir the flour or settle the oats, but to see if anything inside had settled in. A ripple of movement, a tiny subtle, that was your warning, and it wasn't uncommon. In fact, if the sack didn't twitch when you moved it, you were lucky. Grain storage in the medieval world was a constant gamble. Whether you lived in a city cellar or a countryside barn, your food sat in cloth or wooden bins exposed to the elements, the seasons, and the smallest of invaders. Weevils, mealworms, fleas, mites, mice. If it could crawl, it could eat. And if it could eat, it probably found its way into your food supply sooner or later. The infestation didn't start big. It started with one. A single beetle egg clinging to a stalk of rye, overlooked in harvest, ground with the rest. It laid more, and by the time the meal sack was tied and tucked away, the next generation was already chewing its way through your flour. The grains got lighter, hollow, less satisfying to chew. Some people called this air wheat, the kind that filled your mouth and your stomach but offered nothing else. You didn't always see them, but you knew they were there. You smelled them, you tasted them, a bitterness at the back of your tongue, a dryness that didn't belong, the occasional crunch that shouldn't have come from barley. Still, you sifted the flour anyway. You spread the oats out in the sun and watched the darker specks scatter. You skimmed the top, spooned from the middle, hoped that the bottom wasn't as bad as it looked, because grain was too precious to waste. Rats, of course, were worse. They weren't subtle. They gnawed right through the cloth. Their droppings were the unmistakable signature left near every corner of the barn. In big houses, cats were kept for this reason, not as pets, but as pest control. In villages, people whistled for ferrets. In monasteries, traps were baited with lard. But no one stopped the rats. They only slowed them down. Rats ate the best grains. They found the warmest corners. They chewed through wooden barrels and nested in hay. And when they weren't stealing food, they were soiling what was left. Still, the grain was used, because it had to be. The peasant family that lost a third of their oat sack didn't throw it out. They blew the surface clean, sifted it again. They turned it into gruel thickened with whatever they had on hand. They didn't talk about the smell. They didn't mention the fragments. Because if you said the food was bad, you had to admit there was no other food. That was the quiet rule of the pantry. You didn't describe, you prepared. And even among the wealthier households, things weren't much better. Their granaries were larger, but so were their infestations. Bigger storage meant bigger nests. And since most flour was ground fresh, there was no time to process or purify it. If it came with insects, if it went into the dough anyway, sourdough could disguise a lot. People developed methods, of course. Toasted the flour first if the bugs were small, rinsed the grain before boiling, added herbs to dull the flavour of whatever else came with the mash. But no one expected purity. Purity was expensive. Purity was wasted on guests and feast days. For everyone else, the standard was simple. If it didn't bite back, it was good enough. And sometimes it did. Sometimes you stirred the porridge and saw movement that wasn't from the spoon. Sometimes you opened a barley sack and found a mouse staring back, and still you kept stirring. Still you kept cooking, because what choice did you have? But that brings up the uncomfortable question. If the grain never truly belonged to the people who stored it, who exactly were they sharing every meal with? There was a rhythm to grain that people understood long before they could explain it. It shifted as the seasons turned. In spring you hoped for a harvest. In summer you gathered. In autumn you stored. And in winter you waited and watched. Because by winter the grain wasn't just yours anymore. It had been shared with things that didn't ask permission. That was why the pantry had its own smell. Not the sharp scent of herbs or the warm dust of drying bread, but something older, mildew in the wood, the faint rot of damp, the sour edge of grain turned wrong. If you entered a pantry in January and didn't catch that smell, you knew someone had worked very hard to keep it at bay, or that the infestation was quieter than usual. Either way, the silence didn't mean safety. Sifting became an act of caution. You reached into the barrel and ran your fingers through the grain, not for texture, but for heat. A warm patch meant something was nesting. Movement meant eggs. If you pulled your hand back and saw powder where oats should have been, you knew. Something had eaten first. The meal had already been chewed, just not by you, and yet you kept going, because a barrel could not be wasted. You skimmed the top where the mould bloomed. You dug to the bottom, where the weevils hid. You listened to the soft rustle of bugs moving just beneath the surface, and you learned not to flinch. Everyone heard it. No one spoke of it. It was part of the pantry now. Some households roasted their grain first. Others spread it on cloth in the sun, hoping to chase the pests out with light and dryness. A few stirred their flour with iron knives, believing the metal would frighten the creatures out. It didn't. But rituals mattered. Doing something felt better than doing nothing. It made the grain feel yours again. There were even sayings for it. If you can't eat what eats your food, you're not hungry enough, or better a worm that's boiled than one that bites. Children were taught these proverbs early, not here because they made sense, but because they prepared you for the bowl you'd be given. You didn't wrinkle your nose, you didn't push the spoon away, you chewed, slowly, carefully. And if something crunched wrong, you didn't say a word, you swallowed, you moved on. This wasn't stoicism, it was survival. And for all its grotesque inconvenience, grain still meant hope. It was the backbone of the table, turned into bread, thickened into porridge, scattered over stew. It filled the belly even when it arrived with more protein than planned. It was better than root vegetables in a bad year, more reliable than fruit, easier to store than meat. It fed families when gardens failed. It kept the monastery kitchens going through long Lent seasons. It gave just enough, and everyone needed just enough, so they adapted. Cooks began adding more herbs, not for taste, but to mask whatever else might be in the pot. Strong flavours, pungent roots, leeks and garlic. Marjoram, if it could be grown indoors. The goal wasn't flavour, it was distraction. Flour was sifted with cloth stretched tight over bowls, not to refine, but to catch what didn't belong. Fingers ran through dough as it was kneaded. feeling for husks, for seeds that didn't crack right, for beetles that had hidden well enough to bake. And when the bread rose, it was accepted. It didn't matter if something dark showed near the edge, you scraped that off. It didn't matter if the first slice was sour. You fed it to the child who couldn't tell the difference. Because there was always someone hungrier, and hunger left no room for disgust. Still the question remained, quiet but present in the backs of minds, whispered once in a while by firelight. How much of what we ate belonged to us, and how much had we already shared with the creatures too small to ask? By the end of winter, the grain didn't even try to hide its secrets. The sacks had grown soft in the corners. The wooden bins had bowed from moisture. The smell, pungent and sour, a blend of dust, old hay, and something that might once have been alive, was thick in the air. You didn't check the grain anymore to see if it had pests. You assumed it did. The only question was how bad, and whether the bread would rise despite it. That's when flour stopped being an ingredient and started being a challenge. You stirred it gently, hoping it didn't move. You poured it slowly, watching for webs. You held your breath while kneading, not because of effort, but because the powder carried more than grain. The spoiled bits, the skins of insects long dead, the grit of stone from mill wheels long past repair. You mixed with cold water, you salted with caution, you covered it with a cloth and prayed. Sometimes you made flat bread, quick, thin, hard when cooled. It baked fast and lasted long. The insects inside were less noticeable when pressed thin. Other times you stewed the grain, turned it into gruel, boiled until the shape disappeared, until the taste surrendered to garlic or lard or meat scraps that didn't smell quite right. And when that failed, you called it fasting bread, and leaned into the idea that suffering was good for the soul. The monk said mold was a sign to give thanks, that it reminded you nothing on earth was permanent, that if even bread could turn against you, then surely God's mercy was the only thing worth clinging to. People said that with a straight face, then scraped the green from the crust and ate anyway. Because what else was there? There were rules, of course, mostly informal. If the grain had turned entirely to dust, you let it go. If the flour clumped from damp and stuck to the cloth, you cut the cloth and used the rest. If the oats crawled too visibly, you fed them to chickens, if you had chickens. If not, you closed your eyes and boiled them longer. You didn't tell your children what you saw. You didn't let your neighbours see your shame. You fed the ones you loved first, then took what was left. And if it made you sick, you lay still and waited to get better. Or not, because illness came often, and hunger came more, and dignity came last. But no one starved quietly. They complained while chewing, they grumbled while soaking the barley, they cursed the rats, the weevils, the endless frost that crept into cellars and made everything smell like wood rot. And they kept eating, because what the grain gave, no matter how filthy, was still a chance to see spring. And spring meant new seed, new sacks, new hope. You'd air out the pantry, sweep the floors, burn the cloth bags if you could spare the fuel. You'd grind the fresh grain, pretend it would be different this time, and for a little while it would be. But deep down you knew what waited. And so the first time you touched the new sack and felt it shift, you didn't scream, you didn't curse, you didn't even stop, you just smiled, softly, and reached for the sieve. You knew the sound before you ever saw the thief. A soft shuffle, a scratch, pause, the occasional squeak if it thought itself alone. It came in the quiet hours, after the bread had been cut, after the fire had burned low, after the children had curled under blankets made of patched linen and hay. The pantry, still warm from the day's cooking, held on to its scent like a secret. And that's when they came. The mice. They weren't feared the way wolves or sickness were, but they were never welcome. They were too clever, too small, too fast. You could chase a rat with a stick, but a mouse slipped through walls, into floorboards, beneath sacks and baskets and doors. It left nothing but holes in the cloth, droppings in the corner, and just enough grain missing to make a family worry. You couldn't starve a mouse. No matter how poor you were, they ate fiercest. Flour was their favourite. Soft, dry, easy to carry, easier to nest in. You'd go to scoop from the bag in the morning and find the top crusted over, the inside tunnel and the pull and hollow, your fingers brushing not oats or meal, but a sticky patch of mouse fur. And if you caught it early, you dug deeper. If you didn't, you tipped the whole thing out on the table and picked your way through the damage, grain by grain, handful by handful, trying to salvage enough to bake. It was the same with everything they touched. Barley sacks, cheese wheels, dried herbs hung too low from the ceiling, a bite here, nibble there, trail of crumbs in places no human had walked. The mouse never stole much, but it stole often, and when food was scarce, that mattered. There were tricks, of course. You strung up your bread from ceiling beams, you placed your flour on wooden slats, raised high on stones, you hung your cheese from the rafters in cloth sacks knotted tight. But mice were born climbers. They chewed through rope, they leapt farther than you thought possible. They learned your habits, watched your routines, waited for you to grow tired. Some people kept cats, not the soft, sleepy companions of modern homes, but half-wild creatures that earned their keep. A good mouser was worth more than a second blanket in winter. Farmers bartered for kittens, monks fed the best ones meat scraps from the refectory, city dwellers let them roam the alleys and slept easier for it. But even the best cat couldn't catch them all. You never really won against mice, you only delayed them. And when you failed, you didn't throw the food away. You couldn't. You cut around the edges. You scraped the bite marks. You boiled what needed boiling. You closed your eyes. Because food spoiled fast and grew slowly, and the flour in that sack was more than bread. It was the week's meals, the month's hope, the year's survival. And the mouse didn't care. It never meant harm. It just needed the same things you did. Warmth, food, shelter. In a strange way, it lived by the same rules. Only quieter. Only quicker. But that leads to a question that few dared ask out loud. When the mouse nibbled the flour, was it stealing? Or simply sharing? No one ever built a house with mice in mind. And yet, every house made room for them. Not deliberately, not with kindness, but out of inevitability. Thatched roofs sagged, wooden beams cracked, stones shifted, warped by frost and time, and in the tiny spaces between these materials, mice found entry. They needed only the width of a thumb, a gap behind the hearth, a crack in the pantry floor, an inch beneath a door that had lost its hinges. They slipped in quietly and made themselves part of the architecture. They didn't come for chaos. They came for crumbs, and those crumbs were always there. Because medieval life didn't include sealed jars or airtight bins, there were no pantries with latches or kitchens that closed behind doors. Grain was stored in sacks made of old cloth, cheese hung in waxed wraps, tied with fraying cord. Root vegetables were left in baskets, loosely covered with straw. Even cured meat, hard and dry from weeks of salting, hung exposed in rafters or near chimneys, where mice with their determined teeth could gnaw through the rind and reach the fat inside. Families adapted, but only as far as their means allowed. The poor had fewer defences, no stone granaries, no metal containers, just wood and cloth and habit. They learned to notice the small signs, a dark speck where flour should be white, a trail across the hearth dust, a gnawed hole at the bottom of the sack where yesterday there was none. Some tried to patch the damage, others moved the food higher. But the truth settled in over time like ash from the hearth. What the mouse wanted, it would eventually reach. You could only outlast it. Still, it wasn't always war. Sometimes it was something closer to coexistence. A mother would scatter sweepings near the wall, hoping the mouse would take the bait and leave the good grain alone. A child might leave a crust near a corner, saying, "Room for the pantry spirit," as if naming the mouse turned it into something gentler. And in the hush of long winters, when snow covered the world in silence, the sound of tiny feet scurrying beneath the floorboards was oddly comforting. A reminder that something else was still alive, still searching for food, still refusing to die. Of course, there were limits. You tolerated a mouse, maybe two, but when the signs multiplied, droppings across the table, nests in the bedding straw, the sound of gnawing near the cradle, that's when fear crept in. Not just for the food, but for what else the mice might carry. No one knew the word disease, but they knew that sickness came more often when rats appeared, that fevers followed spoilage, that where rodents gathered, people fell ill. They blamed the filth, the air, the water, the cook, the cat who grew lazy, but always, in the back of the mind, the mouse lingered. Even in monasteries where cleanliness was closer to godliness than elsewhere, mice ran under the floor. The monks said nothing, but they swept more often. They wrapped the bread tighter, they whispered extra prayers. Because even behind sacred walls the mouse had found a way in, and still no one won. There were traps, yes, crude ones, weighted pots, stones balanced on sticks, nooses made from string, but for every mouse caught, another 3 waited. You couldn't kill your way out of hunger, not yours and not theirs. You could only ration, reorganize, wake a leer to check the stores, sleep later to listen for rustling. And above all, you learn not to waste. because even chewed food could be used. Bread with holes became porridge, grain mixed with droppings was rinsed and fed to pigs. Cheese with a bite missing was cut and rewrapped, the wound hidden beneath cloth. What couldn't be salvaged was buried, burned, or forgotten, but rarely discarded without guilt, because if the mouse ate too much, the child ate too little, and that was the line no one wanted to cross. But it leads to a difficult truth that sat unspoken in many households. When your meal could be spoiled by a creature smaller than your hand, wasn't that creature just another mouth at the table? By the time spring returned and the last snows retreated into the hills, the damage had already been done. The sacks were lighter. The barley smelled faintly of rot. The flour had grown coarse and clumpy, dotted with black specks that no one dared name aloud. You swept the pantry floor not just for cleanliness, but to count. How many droppings this week? How many teeth marks in the stored onions? How many days left before the new harvest gave you a reason to believe the worst was over? But even as the pantry emptied, the mice remained. They had lived through the winter just as you had, huddled near the warm stones of the hearth, nesting in scraps of cloth and discarded broom straw. They drank from the same water pails, they nibbled the same stale crusts, and in some strange, reluctant way, they had earned their place. You never invited them in, but they'd stayed. They'd survived. And perhaps that was the part that stung the most. Because for all your labour, planting, grinding, baking, boiling, there was still something you couldn't control. The mouse did not plough. The mouse did not tithe. It gave nothing. And yet it fed shamelessly. You resented it. And still you made room. Every village had its lore. Tiny stories passed from one mouth to another like crumbs, about mice that warned of fire, or led starving children to hidden roots, or chewed through the cords of a cursed charm tied too tightly to a barn door. Some said the mouse was sacred, a sign that even the least of creatures deserved bread. Others said killing a mouse on a Sunday would bring misfortune. So you didn't kill it. You coaxed it, tricked it, hoped it would leave without needing a broom. You heard it at night. That was the real truth of the pantry. Its silence was never complete. A knock in the rafters, a shuffle along the beam, a soft sound that came just after the wind had settled, after the baby had stopped fussing, after your breath had gone even. You told yourself it was nothing, that there was still enough left, that you'd find a way to stretch the last handful of oats, that the mouse hadn't taken more than it needed. And maybe it hadn't, because despite everything, you were still here, still baking, still boiling water for bread stew and turning flour into something dense enough to call a meal. The mouse hadn't won, it had merely stayed. And when the first green shoots broke through the soil, when the garden hinted at life again, when the pantry no longer echoed with the same weight, it was easy to forget how much had been lost to creatures you never fully saw. You swept out the corners, aired the sacks, closed the door behind you, and told yourself the pantry would be full again, soon, but deep in the grain in the lowest bin behind the last sack of oats still sweet enough to eat. You knew it waited. Quiet, patient, alive. Because in the medieval world, food was never truly yours. It was borrowed, shared, and sometimes stolen back by paws that didn't ask. There was a day, quiet, grey, colder than expected, when the last scrap of meat was gone. Not carved, not sliced, not even torn by teeth, just boiled out. What remained on the table wasn't a meal, but a memory of one, a bone, clean in some places, still clinging with stubborn sinew in others, cold, dry, hollow, and yet no one reached to throw it away, because in the medieval kitchen, a bone wasn't waste, it was potential. You didn't eat the bone, you extracted it. The process wasn't glamorous, it wasn't romantic, it wasn't even very nourishing, but it was tradition, a kind of quiet reverence for the fact that food didn't end when the flesh was gone. You put the bone in a pot, any pot, but usually the one that had held everything else before it, and covered it with water, just enough. Then you lit the fire and waited. There was no rush, because this wasn't about boiling, it was about coaxing. The fire burned low, the water hissed but never roared. You added onion peels if you had them, a sprig of something dried last summer, rosemary maybe, or the last bitter fennel stalk. A few leaves of cabbage, limp and forgotten at the bottom of the basket, a stone even if you believed in the story of the traveller who made soup from one, and always the bone. The soup took hours, sometimes days. You stirred it now and then, not for flavour but to feel it, to sense whether the broth had deepened. You skimmed off the grey foam that gathered near the edge. You watched the surface settle, then stir again. The smell changed slowly, shifting from nothing to something faintly earthy, not delicious, just warm, and that was enough because you weren't trying to feast. You were trying to remember the meal you already had. Soup made from bones wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to stretch. You drank it in cups, poured it over bread, let it soak into barley. It filled the belly in a way that defied reason. There was nothing in it, but somehow it comforted. Maybe it was the warmth. Maybe it was the habit. Maybe it was the way a hot bowl steadied your hands after a long day of cold or fear or hunger, too sharp to name. In wealthier homes, bone broth was the cook's secret. The kitchen never wasted bones. They were simmered all day, strained through cloth, set aside in jars of clay, and used to add depth to meals that didn't need it. A leg of lamb, glazed with bone broth, a dish of beans, thinned with bone broth, a pastry, brushed with it. It was invisible but present. But for the poor it wasn't hidden, it was the meal, and the more times a bone had been boiled, the more precious it became. Not because it gave more, but because it kept giving. You boiled it once for soup, then again for stew, then you crushed it with a stone and mixed it into dough for the animals, and when even that was done, you kept the biggest bones by the hearth to dry. A child could gnaw on one for an afternoon and think they'd eaten. Some people saved bones in sacks, carried them from one house to another, swapped them like currency, a chicken thigh bone for a beef knuckle, a pork rib for something longer, richer. They talked about bones the way others talked about coins, measuring not weight but promise, and promise was everything. Because when meat disappeared, the bone remained, silent, dry, still capable of becoming something else. But that raises the thought, when the pot only held bones, and the bones only held memory, were people eating the food, or just the idea of it? The second boil was never as strong as the first. By then, most of what the bone had to give was gone. The fat had melted. The marrow, if there was any to begin with, had clouded the broth and settled into the bottom of the pot. What remained was thinner, paler, quieter. A whisper of what once was meat, but that whisper was still a sound in the stomach and in the long hush of a lean winter that mattered more than anyone admitted. So you boiled again. You filled the pot with more water, cold, always cold, and let it warm slowly. No rush. Boiling too fast made it bitter. You added a little something to pretend it still had richness. A few shriveled peas, a scrap of onion. Bread crusts soaked and mashed until they thickened the broth. Not to change the taste, there wasn't much taste left, but to give it weight, to give the mouth something to believe in, because even hunger wants texture. And bone soup, once drained of flavour, became more ritual than recipe. You weren't eating what was there, you were eating what had been there once. What mattered was not that the broth was strong, but that it was warm. Heat was the true nourishment. It settled in your chest. It slowed the shiver in your fingers. It filled the belly just long enough to carry you from one dusk to the next dawn. And if the broth tasted like water kissed with dust, so be it. You added a little salt if you had it. You said thank you anyway. No one ever threw out a bone, not unless it was cracked open, boiled dry and turned to pulp. Even then it was buried, not wasted, mixed with ash or added to compost, ground fine and spread in the garden. Some people tied bone splinters to the base of trees, as offerings to the saints of soil and survival. It wasn't superstition, it was gratitude. The bones had given more than flesh. They had lingered, and anything that lingered was sacred. In monasteries, bones were handled with quiet efficiency, not just from animals, but from people too. A monk's skeleton might rest in one chamber, a pig's femur boil in another, and neither would be treated with disrespect. Flesh was fleeting, bones remained. They were reminders of life, of death, of how little difference there was when the pot was empty. Some said old bones made better broth, that the marrow grew wiser with time, that a stew made from bones 3 days old could cure chills faster than one made fresh. It wasn't true, but it felt true. And in a world held together by what felt true, that was enough. You didn't measure the success of a soup by taste, you measured it by silence, Bill. Did the children eat without asking? Did the elder wipe the bowl clean with bread? Did the house fall asleep with bellies too full for complaint? Then it was a good meal, even if the pot had started with bones alone. But what happens then when bones are all you've known for too long? When you've forgotten what flesh tastes like and only remember the feeling of hot broth in a quiet room? Does the body forget to crave, or does it simply learn to be grateful for what lingers, The final boil wasn't really about food anymore. By then, you weren't expecting nourishment. You knew what the bone had left to give, next to nothing. The broth was thin, barely clouded. The fat had disappeared, the marrow dissolved, the scent reduced to a faint echo of something warmer. But still, you boiled it. You stirred the pot, you filled the bowls, not because anyone expected flavour, but because ritual mattered when food failed. People didn't speak much during that kind of meal. They chewed their bread if they had any, dipped it in what was offered, and swallowed without questions. Sometimes the youngest would ask, "What's in it?" and someone older would answer, "The same as yesterday," and that would be the end of it. Hunger has a way of quieting the need for explanation. What no one said aloud was that the soup by then was more memory than meal. It was the ghost of meat. It was warmth made from history. It was what you made when there was nothing else left to give. Sometimes you left the bones in the pot, not for cooking, but for presence. A kind of proof that there had been something once. A way of saying, "We ate well days ago. Look, see? This was a thigh. That was a rib." They carried weight. They carried meat. And even now, boiled to near disintegration, they made the broth shimmer when stirred. You didn't throw them out. Not yet. They were too clean to offer anything more, but you left them in the pot a while longer. You let the water cool around them. You let the fire die down. You gave the kitchen a few more hours of that strange, steady smell. Salt and ash and something vaguely animal. And then, when you finally emptied the pot, you did so with care. The bones were not garbage, they were worn-out tools. You wrapped them in cloth maybe, buried them near the back of the garden, ground them with stone and scattered them in the chicken yard. A family that owned livestock sometimes fed the scraps to dogs or pigs, if those creatures hadn't already been turned into bones themselves. The cycle was always circling. You boiled what you had, ate what you could, buried what you must. The body was nourished, or not. The soul endured. Some said that the best stews had no recipe, only memory. That a good cook knew not what to add, but what not to take out. And bones, they said, remembered things. The best broths weren't rich with flavour, but with time. You believed it, or you didn't. But you still boiled them anyway. Even when you knew they were empty. Even when the pot felt more like habit than hope. Because when the house was cold and the night was long and the fields gave nothing but wind, a warm bowl, however hollow, was still something to hold. And sometimes that was enough to keep you going, not because it filled you, but because it reminded you that something could be made from almost nothing. The smell hit you before you even unwrapped it. Not sharp, not sour, but thick, coating the nose, clinging to the back of your throat. It was the smell of milk gone too far, of fat that had sweated too long in the wrong kind of heat, of something once soft that now held the flavour of dust and cellar air. You peeled back the linen and found it there. The butter. Greyer than gold. Slicker than it should have been. With edges darkened and cracked like a block of old lard left too close to the fire. And still, you didn't throw it out. Because butter, even when wrong, was still butter. And rancid butter was a known quantity. Its taste, unpleasant as it might be, was familiar. Predictable. You knew how to cook with it. You knew how to bury it under other flavours. And more than anything else, you knew what it cost. Making butter wasn't a small task. It required milk, fresh and plentiful, which meant you needed a cow or a goat fed and healthy enough to give. The milk had to sit until the cream rose. The cream had to be skimmed, cooled and churned. Churned for hours, by hand. In a wooden tub that needed to be cleaned each time, with hot water and cloth, even when water was short and cloth was needed elsewhere. And when the butter came together, when it clumped, softened, gave way under the paddle, it had to be shaped, wrapped, and kept somewhere cool. A cellar, a spring house, a clay pot in the shade, buried half deep in the ground. There were no fridges, no reliable cold, so butter lived on the edge of decay from the moment it was made. You used the fresh butter fast, on bread, in porridge, mixed with herbs for the rare guest or feast. What didn't get used turned, slowly at first, a faint change in smell, then faster, especially in warm weather. The surface grew slick, the taste shifted from creamy to bitter. Still, you kept it, because throwing it out meant explaining why there would be no butter for the stew, no grease for the pan, no richness in the barley cakes. So you found ways to make it work. Rancid butter went into dough, where flour and heat could mask its edge. It went into frying pan sauce, where onions sizzled loudly enough to drown out the smell. It was mixed with garlic or horseradish, anything stronger, until the bitterness blurred. Sometimes it was spread on crusty bread, the kind already too old to notice the difference. Children didn't complain. They didn't know there was a difference. They licked their fingers and asked for more, and their mother said nothing. Even in noble households, butter didn't stay golden for long. It arrived in clay pots, carried by servants from the dairy, sealed with soaked linen and cool air. But by the time it reached the kitchens, it had already begun to soften. Cooks whispered about it, changed the menu, thickened sauces, adjusted seasonings. They didn't speak of spoilage, they spoke of depth, of age, of robustness. It was the same rancid butter, just dressed in fancier language. In monasteries where food was rationed and flavour discouraged, butter was kept under strict watch. The cellarer might lock it away, the cook might weigh it. Monks used it for feast days, for bread too rough to swallow on its own, or for mixing with herbs during Easter. If it had soured by then, they said it was a test of humility. And no one questioned that, because complaining about butter, any butter, was a mark of privilege, of softness, of forgetting where food came from and what it cost. So you ate. You wrinkled your nose, maybe, you drank something after, but you ate, because that curl of grease in the pan was the only thing standing between you and another bland, dry meal. And the smell? You got used to it. Eventually. That raises the question, if butter could turn and still be welcomed at the table, because what else did people learn to swallow? By midsummer, the butter in the cellar had lost all pretense of freshness. The clay pot that once held its shape now held a slumped mass, edges slick and darkening. The linen that wrapped it had stiffened with age and oil. No one needed to lift the lid to know what they would find, but lift it they did, because the bread still needed spreading, the pan still needed greasing, and the soup, thin and tired, still needed something to carry the taste of salt. And even now, when the butter had gone too far for most, it was still closer to edible than anything else within reach. People didn't call it rancid, not out loud. They called it strong, sharp. Well kept. That was the word often used. Kept. As if time were a seasoning. You said it with a shrug, maybe with a smile. This butter is well kept. You didn't say it tasted like cheese gone sour or that the smell clung to the knife for days. You just said it was older. And that was that. Because everyone had their limit, but no one wanted to admit they'd reached it first. There was a quiet pride in withstanding it. Turning bad butter into tolerable food was a skill. Cooks knew when to scrape off the outer layer, when to stir it into porridge where children wouldn't taste it, when to mix it with herbs just bold enough to distract but not overpower. Onions worked well. So did garlic and crushed peppercorns, if you could afford them. Mustard, ground fresh or spooned from a well-sealed jar, could drown the worst of it. So could ale. And so you kept cooking. The skillet hissed as the butter hit it. That was always a good sign. Heat could kill almost anything, or at least convince you it had. The smell sharpened, turned nutty, then bitter, then thin. You added onions, potatoes, slices of hard bread, a bit of leftover grain. You stirred. You served. No one asked what made it slick. They just saw the shimmer and called it richness. That was how meals survived. Not by freshness, but by memory. Memory of what butter once tasted like, of how it softened crusty bread, of the days when the churn turned fast and the smell was sweet. That memory lingered longer than the butter itself, and it was enough. In wealthier kitchens, where people had choices, the rancid butter was still used. Just not for guests. It flavoured the servant's stew. It was brushed onto loaves before baking. It was used in the crust of a pie so heavily seasoned that no one noticed what had gone in. Cooks didn't waste, even when they could. Not because they feared poverty, but because they remembered it. Most of them had come from households where the butter had always been old, where flavour was less important than function. Monasteries rarely complained. Their diets were plain by design, their meals simple, their expectations low. A monk might eat the same barley porridge for weeks, seasoned only by age and temperature. When butter appeared, even if sour, it was received as a blessing. Used to fry herbs on feast days, to grease the iron pans, or to soften the bark-hard loaves that accompanied most meals. If it smelled too strongly, they ate in silence and offered thanks anyway. And still no one threw it out. That was the great truth of the pantry. Things weren't discarded because they were bad. They were discarded only when they were dangerous. Butter never quite crossed that line. It hovered near it day after day, growing darker, growing stronger, testing how far the tongue would go in exchange for a little grease. And most of the time, the tongue surrendered, because eating spoiled butter was still better than going without. And that leads us to a deeper thought. If you learn to cook your way around decay, what did that do to your idea of what food even was? By the time winter came, no one expected the butter to smell good. The scent of spoilage had become so embedded in daily life that it no longer announced itself with alarm. It simply joined the rest of the household, a background presence, no more offensive than the scent of old wool, wet earth, or the slow mildew creeping along the inside corners of a thatched roof. The butter had aged, curled at the edges, sweated through cloth. It gave off an odour now as familiar as wood smoke. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't shocking either. It was simply the scent of fat surviving the season. And still, it was used. Scraped into porridge, rubbed onto pot bread before baking, melted into beans or leeks or anything too bland to eat alone. A good cook could make it pass. The right spices, the right heat, a little wine or ale, a change in texture, all helped to disguise the fact that the butter had long since crossed the threshold between sweet and sharp. But everyone knew. They just didn't say it aloud. Even in homes that could afford better, the old butter remained in circulation. No one tossed it, not unless it had turned so completely that it could no longer hold its shape. Then maybe it was fed to the pigs, or used to grease hinges, polish leather, even cork draughty corners. Butter, spoiled or not, still held use. That was the rule. Everything had a second purpose, nothing died clean. But more often than not, it never got that far. People didn't waste food because food didn't come easily. A bad churn, a sick cow, a thief in the night, a cracked clay pot. These things could mean a week without fat, and fat was what kept you warm when there was nothing else. It padded the belly, lubricated the joints. It slicked the inside of a starving body just enough to ease it through the days when bread turned hard and broth ran thin. So you ate the butter. You scraped the cloth clean. You ignored the bitterness or swallowed fast. Even the children learned to keep quiet about it. They turned up their noses once, maybe twice, and then their mothers glared, or their fathers smacked the table, or their grandmother leaned in and whispered, "Be grateful. There are houses with nothing to fry." And they nodded, because hunger taught obedience faster than discipline ever could, and over time taste adjusted. You began to expect the bite of rancidity. You learnt the subtle vocabulary of spoilage. This butter is sharp. That butter is smoky. This one is too soft. That one clings to the throat. But you didn't stop eating it. Because what it was mattered less than what it meant. It meant the cow had survived long enough to give. It meant the churn had been worked for hours. It meant the fire had been lit, the milk skimmed, the cloth prepared. It meant labour and time and risk, and none of those things were taken lightly. So you used the butter. All of it. You learned how far it could go before it turned against you. And sometimes it did. It upset the stomach, left a sourness in the throat, coated the tongue in a way that lingered through the night. But no one blamed the butter. They blamed the season, or the cow, or the cook. And then they ate again. Because in the medieval kitchen, food wasn't about enjoyment. It was about momentum. You kept going, even when the butter had long since given up its best, even when it reminded you more of the cellar than the pasture, even when it turned every bite into a compromise. You kept going. Because hunger never waited, and survival never paused for preference. You didn't drink water unless you had to, not because you disliked it. No one in the medieval world had the luxury of disliking anything so basic, but because water, more often than not, made you sick. You didn't always know why. You just knew that people who drank from the wrong stream or the wrong bucket, or even the wrong cup at the wrong time of year, often ended up doubled over with pain. Or worse, so you drank ale. Weak, flat, warm, often sour, but trusted, because it had been boiled, because it had been fermented, because it had been made. Water, by contrast, simply was. It ran in the rivers that carried waste, it pooled in wells dug too shallow, it collected in barrels outside doorways, gathering leaves and insects and more. There were clean springs, yes. There were good wells sometimes, but not every village had one. And even when you had a good source, the bucket might be dipped with dirty hands, or the rope might have touched the ground, or someone might have washed their feet just upstream. And then the water turned. It didn't warn you, it didn't darken or smell or bubble. It just changed. And your stomach followed. So people turned to ale. Small ale mostly, weak in alcohol, barely fermented, often brewed at home in wooden tubs. It was cloudy, tasted like grain gone tired, and went sour within a day or two. You didn't drink it to feel merry, you drank it because it was safe, because the act of boiling the mash and fermenting the sugars had, through generations of trial and error, proven itself to be reliable. Children drank it, monks drank it, labourers drank it by the bucket, not the cup. A household might go through barrels a week, not for celebration, but just to stay hydrated. The brewing fell to women usually. In most households, the alewife made the drink. She soaked the grain, boiled it, stirred it, cooled it, added the balm, the frothy yeasty top from a previous brew. She watched it bubble in its tub for a day, sometimes two. Then she poured it into jugs, sealed them with cloth, and started again. It was routine, as familiar as baking bread or feeding chickens, and just like with bread, there were good batches and bad. Ale, that was too sweet, too flat, that turned too quickly in the heat, that didn't turn at all, that made people ill. But water did that more, so ale stayed. Even when it tasted of smoke or wood or dust from the grain sack, even when it fizzed too much or not at all, even when it spoiled and smelled like something forgotten, because water came with fear and ale came with habit. You knew what to expect from it. You trusted it in a way that went beyond flavour or clarity. You knew that if the pot was clean, if the grain was good, if the fire stayed hot and the cool place stayed cool, the ale would see you through the day. And so it filled the table, poured at breakfast alongside coarse bread, drunk at midday when the sun had crested and the tools had grown heavy, lifted again at dusk in pewter cups or wooden mugs as the fire caught low and the day softened into sleep. There were no toasts, no merriment, just warmth, just routine, just something that wouldn't turn your stomach inside out before the night was done. But that raises a question that lingered beneath the surface of every tankard. If ale became the only drink you could trust, did anyone even remember what clean water tasted like? It wasn't the alcohol that saved them, it was the boil. People didn't know about microbes, of course. They had no idea what bacteria were, or how waterborne illness spread from the waste they tossed into rivers and pits. But they knew what they saw. They saw that travellers who drank from a still pond often grew pale and weak. That children who scooped handfuls of water from streams during summer sometimes didn't wake the next morning. That water that looked clear could turn deadly with no warning. So the habit formed, not out of science, but out of survival. You boiled what you drank, or you fermented it, or you flavoured it with herbs that stung the throat and numbed the tongue. You learned to make small ale because it was the only thing you could give your child that didn't leave them clutching their belly. You stirred the mash every morning, strained it with cloth that had been wrung out and dried by the hearth, sealed the jugs with waxed linen, and said nothing about the sourness, because sour was safe, flat was familiar. Bubbling too much? That was worth watching. But clean water, untouched, was a gamble most wouldn't take. Communities understood this long before anyone tried to explain it. In towns with markets and taverns, ale was constant. You might find 2 or 3 barrels near the hearth at any inn, ready to be drawn off for the price of a copper. Not strong enough to cause a stumble, but strong enough to hold its shape on the tongue. Even monasteries, which frowned on excess and forbade drunkenness, brewed daily. Their ale was thin, often bland but carefully made. Brewing was as sacred as baking. The monk who oversaw it wasn't just a cook, he was a steward of health. In smaller villages, ale was a currency of its own. The alewife might offer jars in trade for flour or herbs. A neighbour with a better mash might lend yeast from the bottom of his last batch. A woman brewing alone might exchange her strongest ale for a cut of salted fish. It was part of life, not luxury, not escape, but insurance, and everyone drank it. From the priest to the ploughman, from the weaning child to the ageing widow. If you didn't drink ale, people assumed you were ill, or untrustworthy, or both. Even the sick drank it, when fevers came, when coughs deepened, when bellies swelled and limbs went weak. The ale stayed at the bedside. Water might worsen the illness. Ale, at least, would not. Warmed ale with honey if you had it, ale with crushed herbs, ale with old bread to thicken it. It became a medicine, or something close to it. Not because it cured, but because it didn't kill. And in a world with few certainties, that was miracle enough. Of course, not all ale was equal. There were brews that turned foul in the barrel, brews that bubbled wrong, brews that carried sickness instead of safety, tainted by mould or bad grain or hands that hadn't been washed since last week's butchering. But people learned. They watched. They remembered who brewed clean and who didn't. A good alewife had a steady line at her door. A bad one found her name whispered alongside fevers. And still ale held on, because water was still feared, Even when it was cold, even when it was clear, even when it came from the old well behind the church. Because someone remembered a winter when it turned strange, when the whole household drank from it and spent 3 days groaning in the dark. You didn't forget that. You passed the story down. You taught your children how to stir the mash, when to lift the lid, what sourness was safe and what was not. And they listened, because they had seen the difference. But that leaves us wondering, when boiling became the only trustworthy part of drinking, did people stop seeing water as a gift and start seeing it as a threat? By the time generations had passed, people stopped asking why ale was on the table at every meal. It was just there, next to the bread, in the hand of the labourer, poured for the child, the monk, the bride, the grieving. It was drunk without ceremony and without suspicion. Water had faded from the rhythm of daily life, not entirely forgotten, but moved to the edges, used for laundry, for washing wounds, for soaking beans. You fetched it from the well, you poured it into the pot, but you didn't sip it straight unless you had no other choice. Even those who lived near clear-running springs hesitated. Some did drink it, quietly. But only if they had watched the stream for weeks, only if no animals drank upstream, only if it bubbled fast and cold from stone, and even then, the first cup was taken carefully. Sip. Wait, watch your stomach. People didn't call it testing, they called it taking a measure, and they always kept ale nearby just in case. Taverns, even the smallest ones, never offered water. Not because it wasn't available, but because no one would pay for what could kill them. You bought ale, or mead, or cider, and even those were often thin, half-fermented, barely more than flavoured water, but they were made, handled, stirred by someone, and that made them safer. Water was unmade. It just was. And the more people leaned into ale, the more they forgot what water truly was meant to taste like. They remembered rivers as pathways, not fountains. They remembered wells as lebar, not refreshment. They remembered rain as a thing to fear, muddy, cold, full of sickness. And so the tongue changed. Children raised on small ale grew up knowing only its warmth, its musty sweetness, its dull tang when it turned. When water was forced on them during fasts or punishments or deep summer droughts, they sipped it like a stranger. They said it tasted thin, empty, cold in a way that didn't feel clean but uncertain. And perhaps, in a way, they were right. Because in their world, cleanliness had nothing to do with clarity. It had to do with control, with process, with human hands boiling, brewing, stirring. And water did none of that. Water came on its own terms, flooded when it wanted, froze without warning, dried up when the barley was planted. It was not obedient. So people turned away from it and trusted ale. Even when it made them slow, even when it kept them tired, even when they forgot what it was like to drink without swallowing foam. Because that foam meant safety, and safety was rare. But over time, something else happened, quietly, in places not talked about. People began to wonder what they'd lost. They asked, in rare moments, what the stream at the edge of the village might taste like. They dipped a hand in the spring and held the water in their palm a little longer than necessary. They watched rain fall into barrels and didn't turn away. And once in a while someone drank, just a sip, and said nothing. Because admitting it out loud might unsettle everything. But the truth lingered anyway, like the final dregs in a tankard. They had forgotten water, but it had never forgotten them. There were no forks. That's the first thing to understand about sitting down to eat in the year 1300. You had a knife, your own, usually carried on your belt, and a pair of hands that had been washed if water was available and remembered, but often weren't. The meal, no matter how grand or humble, began not with clinking silver, but with shared bowls, uneven spoons, and the silent understanding that the table belonged to everyone seated around it. And so did the food. Etiquette wasn't absent. It just followed different rules. At a nobleman's feast, where the tables stretched from stone hearth to draughty door and the candles flickered in iron sconces, you might be seated beside someone you barely knew. You'd share a trencher, a thick, square slab of stale bread that doubled as a plate. Stew was ladled into it, meat laid atop it. As you ate, the juices soaked the bread. Some diners ate the trencher at the end, others didn't. It was often given to the poor waiting outside or tossed to the dogs. But while you sat there, elbows close, breaths visible in the cold, you and your neighbour both reached toward the same dish. That required restraint. You didn't reach across the table. You didn't take the best bit of meat first. You didn't speak with a full mouth or lick your knife or wipe your hands on your cloak if a cloth was nearby. You used the hem of your tunic, perhaps, or your sleeve. Napkins existed, strips of linen folded neatly and placed beside favoured guests. But only in the wealthier homes, and only when the household wanted to impress. Most people dined without them. Knives were essentially. You brought your own, and it said much about who you were. It was used for cutting meat, portioning cheese, and spearing vegetables, spreading butter. But it was never pointed at another guest. That was considered threatening. Nor did you pass your knife across the table. If someone asked, they borrowed it from your side, carefully and with a nod. Spoons were less personal, made of wood, sometimes horn, rarely metal unless you were rich. They were used for pottage, broth, or sauces too thin to chase with bread. But they weren't always shared. In some houses, one spoon travelled the table. You took your turn, wiped it on your tunic, and handed it to the next person. Drinking vessels passed in a similar fashion. A single cup might travel the circle, wiped only lightly between hands. You learned to sip, not gulp. To drink from the same side you'd already touched. To keep your mouth clean, if not before the meal, then at least during it. No one wanted to taste another's spit, but they often did. This was considered normal. Not rude, just practical. The poor had their own rules. Meals were quicker, quieter, a bowl of grain mash, a chunk of onion, a crust of bread. Everything eaten by hand. Children sat on floors. Elders held their food close à l'eau. You didn't waste. You didn't take more than your share. You didn't speak unless it was to ask for salt or thank the cook. Manners were enforced with glances, with elbows, with muttered scolding if someone tore the loaf too greedily. And always there was the expectation that you'd finish. Not to be polite, but because the next meal wasn't guaranteed. At monasteries, meals were taken in silence. The brothers sat in rows, spoons lifted in near-perfect rhythm, bowls refilled by the server at the end of the table. No one chewed loudly, no one looked around, and no one spoke. If you wanted something, more bread, a pinch of salt, a second ladle, you gestured or waited. Speech belonged to prayer, not to hunger. In every corner of the medieval world, food was a shared thing. You didn't dine alone unless you were ill or unwelcome. You broke bread with others, passed meat from one hand to the next, looked your neighbour in the eye and hoped they'd do the same. And if they licked their fingers, you tried not to watch. Because that was the final rule: don't look too closely at how others ate, not unless you wanted to lose your appetite. It wasn't that people lacked manners in 1300, they simply followed a different set of expectations, ones shaped not by cutlery or personal space, but by scarcity, status, and the simple fact that meals were too important to get bogged down by niceties that wasted time or food. You didn't worry about crumbs on the tablecloth when there was no tablecloth. You didn't concern yourself with elbows on the table when the table was just a board propped on barrels, and you certainly didn't complain if someone tore their bread with both hands and leaned in close. That was how food was eaten, communally, quickly, and with a touch of mess. The trenchers were the anchor of most meals. Thick slices or slabs of bread, several days old by the time they reached the table. They were never meant to be appetizing on their own. They were tools, sturdy enough to hold stew or salted meat without crumbling. As the juices soaked in, the bottom grew soft, soggy, almost spoonable. That was when the decision came: eat the trencher, or leave it behind. The poor ate it. The wealthy often didn't. They gave theirs to the dogs or the beggars waiting outside the gate, where it was prized more than any fresh loaf. If you sat at a feast, you'd be assigned your own trencher, but not necessarily your own meal. Most dishes were shared between 2 or more diners. A roasted fowl might be split, not evenly but instinctively. One person cutting the breast, the other taking the wing. No one took the best bit without offering it first. That was bad form, and bad form could follow you. People remembered how you ate, and they judged accordingly. And yet some indulgences were accepted. You could belch, for example. It wasn't rude, it was practical. A loud belch at the end of a meal meant you were full and satisfied. In some circles, especially among the nobility, it was even considered polite. What wasn't polite was wasting food. Leaving a leg of lamb untouched while asking for another was seen as arrogance, not appetite. You finished what you took, or you passed it on. Hands were washed before meals, if water was available. In wealthy households, this ritual was performed with warm water poured from a jug over a basin held by a servant. In humbler homes, a communal bowl might be passed around, water already cloudy with the day's labour. You wiped your hands on your tunic, sometimes on a cloth, sometimes on the nearest piece of straw, but once the meal began, Hands were fair game. You used them for tearing bread, for scooping grains, for cracking open bones. You pinched salt with your fingers, you used your knife for carving, but your hands did the rest. And if they got greasy, you simply wiped them when you could. On your sleeve, on your hair, on the table's edge. That was normal. What wasn't normal was staring. Watching someone eat too closely was impolite. Even in silence, mealtimes were private in a way that had nothing to do with solitude. They were shared, but not exposed. You gave your neighbour space, figuratively if not physically. You didn't comment on how quickly they chewed, or how often they reached for more. You didn't mock the way they licked their fingers clean. You didn't joke if they spilled ale on their lap. Food was too sacred for that, too hard-earned. Monks followed stricter rules. They ate with their heads lowered, their portions measured, their conduct watched by a reader who recited scripture while they dined. There was no talking, no glancing, no second helpings unless offered. If a brother dropped his bread, he picked it up and kissed it. Food was a blessing, not a performance. In peasant homes, the rules were simpler, but no less binding. You waited for the eldest to begin. You didn't eat while someone was praying. You fed the children first if food was short, or the oldest if the work was harder the next day. You said thank you, even if the meal was only gruel and a crust. And after the meal, you helped clean not with cloth and polish, but with your hands. You cleared the bones, you swept the crumbs, or you shook out the cloth or shook off the table, and then you stepped outside and let the others finish if they hadn't eaten yet. But perhaps the most striking thing about etiquette in 1300 wasn't what was done, it was what was endured. Because when the food was shared, and the trenchers were soaked, and the cups had passed through 4 different hands, you didn't complain. You were fed, and that was enough. By the time the bowls were scraped and the bread was gone, the room settled into that familiar kind of quiet, the kind that followed fullness but not indulgence. No one leaned back in satisfaction. They sat still, sleeves streaked with broth, fingers greasy, eyes slow. Hunger had left, but not far. It never wandered far in 1300. And that was why table manners mattered, not because they made a meal polite, but because they made the act of survival feel shared. You weren't eating alone, you were eating alongside. That was the central rule, spoken or not. The trenchers may have been cut unevenly, the broth may have been thin, the bread may have been hard, but if your hands reached into the same bowl as someone else's, you owed them your patience. You didn't push, you didn't hoard, you let the ladle pass. You waited your turn with the knife. You broke your bread cleanly and kept your sleeves away from the stew if you could help it. Feasting wasn't only for the rich, but the poor did it differently. Their celebrations came with fewer dishes, but just as much ritual. A wedding meal in a village might mean a bigger pot of barley and some meat, but still only 1 spoon for 3 people. A holy day might mean bread baked with honey or cheese brought out from storage, but you still ate it from your lap on a bench shared with 3 others. There were rules even then. Give the first cut to the guest, let the bride's father eat before the younger sons, say the blessing before the food cooled. Manners weren't written down, they were passed hand to hand like everything else. You taught your child not to spit crumbs into the bowl. You taught your brother not to lick the spoon between turns. You taught your cousin that if he wanted more, he should ask, not take. And you enforced it not with scolding, but with glances, a sharp elbow, a silence that meant, don't embarrass the table. Because the table, such as it was, mattered. Even when it was just a board laid over barrels. Even when you ate on your knees beside the hearth. Even when table meant nothing more than a space where others gathered, and the pot stood warm. Meals were not private. There was no dignity in eating alone, and no privacy in a household where 3 generations slept in one room. So eating became a kind of trust. You let others see you chew. You let them pass the meat near your face. You tasted what they tasted. You wiped your hands, knowing someone else would handle the same loaf next. And you never said what you saw, if their fingers were dirty, or their nose ran, or their teeth were blackened. That wasn't etiquette, that was mercy. The idea of individual plates, personal servings, sanitized forks and distant chairs, that belonged to another time, a future still far away. In 1300 the body was part of the meal. You heard others swallow. You watched mouths work. You smelled what the other had eaten. And if you got ill the next day, you didn't blame anyone. That was just life. And in a strange way there was comfort in that. Because eating wasn't a performance. It was proof of community. The pot was shared, and so were the hands, and so was the risk. You ate what your neighbour ate. You drank what your sister drank. You broke your bread so someone else could see you'd done it fairly. And when the bowl was finally empty and the spoon came to rest in silence, you left the table with a little less hunger and a little more trust in the ones who stayed to eat beside you. It wasn't soft, not even after soaking in water for 2 days and boiling it 3 times, not even after you scraped the outer layer with a knife to remove the last of the crusted salt that had turned from white to grey in the dark of the pantry. The fish didn't flake apart or melt on the tongue. It tore, fibrous, chewy, somewhere between bark and jerky. And the smell? It clung to your fingers for hours, sour, sharp, with a hint of rot that no amount of boiling could fully erase. But it was food, and that was enough. Salted fish was the meat of people who couldn't afford fresh slaughter. It was caught in the North Sea, the Baltic, the Bay of Biscay, anywhere men with strong arms and weak stomachs could drop a net and drag back something that wouldn't swim away too quickly. Cod was best. It dried well, took the salt deep into its bones and hardened like a plank. Herring was common, mackerel too, though it spoiled faster. Whatever the fish, the process was the same. Gut it, split it, bury it in salt, and let time take over. It was stacked in barrels, thick with brine, until the flesh stiffened into something that didn't rot, at least not quickly. Then it was hauled by cart or ship to towns and monasteries, to cities far from the coast where fish hadn't been seen with eyes or scales in months. By the time it reached your table, it was hard as stone, nearly flavourless beneath the salt, and carried the scent of every person who had handled it. Still, it fed entire winters. You soaked it overnight in the coldest water you could find, changing it every few hours. Sometimes a river, sometimes the well, sometimes a cracked wooden basin set out beside the hearth. The water turned white with salt, then cloudy, then strangely greasy. But you kept going, because the fish wasn't ready until it bent without snapping, and even then it fought the knife. Boiling came next, not once, at least twice, maybe 3 times, in onion water, if you had onions, with a dash of vinegar if your stomach was sensitive. Some added stale ale, others just prayed. And then you served it. Not with ceremony, with bread if there was any, with peas or beans or mashed roots to blunt the salt. You didn't eat salted fish alone, you ate it while chasing bites with thin ale or rinsing your mouth between swallows. You picked the bones carefully, not because you feared choking, but because even the bones were salty and no one wanted to waste a bite. Children didn't like it. No one did really. But children learned early that meals weren't about liking, they were about lasting. On Fridays, even nobles ate fish, not by choice but by church decree. You abstained from flesh of the land, and so the sea offered its version. Of course, the rich had better options: fresh eels, buttered trout, pike roasted in wine and herbs. But even they turned to salted cod when the rivers froze and the merchants didn't arrive. The poor had no such variety. To them, salted fish was meat, feast, proof that someone in the house had planned ahead, bartered wisely, or scraped enough coin together to buy a barrel before winter. And so they chewed, and so they swallowed, and so they drank afterward. Because when your belly was empty and the wind pushed smoke back down the chimney and the last cabbage in the garden had frozen to mush, salted fish was survival pressed into slabs, and when the bones were picked clean and the salt still burned your lips, you looked at the next slab with gratitude. Not because it was good, but because it was there. Still, if meat is meant to nourish and comfort, and this fish did neither, what exactly were people feeding besides their fear of hunger? No one ever said salted fish was pleasant. They said it kept. That was the word used again and again. Kept, like it was a promise that if everything else failed, this slab of brine-soaked flesh would remain. And that's what it did. It stayed, in the cellar, on the pantry shelf, hung from the rafters in greasy cloth bundles that dripped slowly when the days grew warm. It waited, long after the bread had moulded and the cheese had collapsed in on itself. It was the last thing you ate when you had no other options, and often the first thing you stocked when winter loomed. The fear wasn't in the fish itself, it was in what it represented. To run out of salted meat meant gambling with hunger. Fresh meat was rare. Vegetables could be grown, yes, but they could also rot, freeze, sprout badly. Even grain could be stolen by rats, but salted fish? That was safe. It was unpleasant, yes, but safe. If it was hard, you boiled it. If it was bitter, you covered it in garlic. If it was too salty to swallow, you mashed it with bread and drank something behind it. And that fear, the fear of running out, was passed on as naturally as a surname. Mothers taught their daughters to scrape the barrel clean. even if the bottom pieces stank of wood and brine. Fathers taught their sons how to stack the fillets so they wouldn't stick together and tear when thawed. Everyone in the house knew how many were left, whether spoken aloud or counted silently. The tally stayed with you. In years of plenty, you rationed it. In lean years, you ate it cold and silent, chewing so long your jaw ached. It was never the main part of the meal, not really. It was the backdrop, the foundation, the insurance against failure. And it was always handled with care. You didn't overboil it. You didn't waste the soaking water if you didn't have to. That water, milky and sour, might be used to flavour soup, to boil bitter greens, to rinse out the pan so the next meal had something in it. And still the fish didn't soften. It stayed tough, like the hands that prepared it, like the mouths that endured it. Even in monasteries where self-denial was a virtue, salted fish was both penance and provision. It fed the brothers who had given up meat. It filled bowls on Friday when the rule forbade flesh, and it reminded them, subtly, sternly, of the fragility of the body and the weight of preservation. Nobles kept it too, not because they needed it, but because they feared the day they might. A well-stocked cellar wasn't just a sign of wealth, it was insurance. Salted fish stacked high in barrels and wrapped in cloth told guests and servants alike, "We are prepared, even if the roads freeze, even if the hunt fails, even if the town turns to riot." That was the true role of salted fish, not to please, but to prevent panic. But the longer it sat, the more it seemed to forget what it once was. By spring, some pieces had lost their colour, turned grey with a green edge or grown soft in ways they shouldn't. You trimmed those parts away. You didn't ask questions, you boiled harder, you stirred faster, you added more salt. Because when the food that fed you started to resemble something else entirely, you changed the way you looked at it. You called it safe, even if it smelled of rot. You called it strong, even if it bit the tongue. You called it useful, because anything else meant admitting you had run out of choices. And no one, no matter how poor or proud, wanted to say that out loud. By the 3rd or 4th month of eating it, the body didn't flinch anymore. Your tongue still recoiled at the first bite, but your hands moved without hesitation. The knife knew where to cut. The fingers knew how to tear along the grain. The teeth had learned not to chew so much as grind. Slowly, steadily, like sharpening a blade with your own jaw. You didn't notice the smell anymore, not because it faded, but because it became familiar. It clung to the rafters, to the cloth that wrapped the barrels, to your fingers no matter how many times you rinsed them. The scent of salt and old sea was part of you now. This was what it meant to endure. Meals were not meant for pleasure. They were meant to quiet the ache in your belly. Salted fish did that better than most things. It didn't spoil easily. It filled the mouth with something to work against. It left behind the sense of having eaten, even if your stomach still asked for more. You paired it with porridge, with boiled peas, with barley that had started to sprout at the edge of the sack. You didn't ask whether it tasted good. You asked whether there was enough. Children came to accept it too. They watched their elders soak it, boil it, stew it with bitter herbs. They chewed the flakes, swallowed the gristle, and said nothing. Complaining about the fish was a luxury, and they had never been taught that luxury existed. A full bowl, even of something foul, was never an insult. It was a gesture of protection. But the body paid a price. Salt pulled water from the skin, from the mouth, from the veins. You drank more. You needed to, but water was scarce or feared, and ale only went so far. Some days the fish left you dizzy. Other days it made your gums bleed. Still, you chewed, because hunger hurt more than salt. In the wealthier households, the cook worked harder to disguise it. Poached in wine, glazed with honey and mustard, wrapped in pastry crust, ground and pressed into fritters with eggs and herbs. But everyone still knew. The salt couldn't be hidden, only balanced. In lean years, there were no such attempts. You boiled it and hoped the boiling was enough. You served it with turnips if you had them, or bread if you didn't. You wiped your fingers on your tunic and drank something behind each bite. What you didn't do was waste it. No matter how bad the taste, no matter how thick the salt, no matter how many meals it had already been boiled into, even when it looked more like leather than food, even when it curled at the edges like bark left too long in the sun, you still ate it, because the salted fish on the table meant that you, or someone in your house, had planned ahead, had bartered or traded or scraped together enough coin in the warmer months to prepare for this moment. It meant you'd made it this far, and that maybe, just maybe, you'd make it a little farther. And in that way salted fish, however brittle, however bitter, became something sordid. Not because it was good, but because it lasted. Because in a world where almost nothing stayed, it was still there. Still solid, still chewable, still salt. Still something you could put in your mouth and say, I am not hungry. Not yet. And so the door to the pantry closes. The crumbs remain. The mice are still. What once bustled with the noise of servants and the clatter of clay bowls now breathes only in silence. As the sounds and scents of the past fade into the hush, a soft idea lingers. How even in the messiest corners of history, people simply did what they could to nourish those they loved, with what little they had. And now, there are no more stories to follow tonight, only the hush of history and your own peaceful breath. Let the world fade away. May you find calm, and may your dreams be gentle and deep.